asking me, well, Mike, where are you living? I was not really anywhere, I'm just bouncing around from place to place, I just live everywhere but nowhere, Not homeless, it's just, never find me anywhere for too long.
15-year-old Seth Jackson was beaten, shot, and burned at a Summerfield home Sunday.
He walks into the courtroom with slow steps, the purple shirt, the trimmed hair, and an air of confidence from someone who thinks he will go unpunished. He smiles in court, mocks in his testimony, until the sentence destroys his arrogance. This is the story of Michael Shane Bargo, and what he did to stand before that jury will shock you. To understand how this young man ended up there, it's necessary to go back a bit in time. Seth Jackson was only 15 years old, and that night believed he finally had the chance to resolve a conflict, maybe talk, maybe vent, with his ex-girlfriend, Amber Wright. What he didn't know was that the invitation to meet her was part of a calculated, cruel, and fully premeditated plan. A plan that had been circulating for weeks among a group of teens led by Michael Shane Bargo, an 18-year-old whose name would be forever marked in Florida's criminal history. The crime that took Seth's life wasn't just brutal. It was cold. Choreographed. Driven by an explosive mix of resentment, manipulation, and violence. Amber, who had once been close to Seth, had now become the link that would lead him straight into a trap. The house where everything would happen belonged to Charlie Ely, another accomplice, and inside it were the other participants, Kyle Hooper and Justin Soto. Each of them had a role. Each of them knew what was going to happen. And no one did anything to stop it. Seth entered the place without suspecting anything. Maybe he believed Amber only wanted to talk. Maybe he expected some kind of reconciliation. But as soon as he crossed the door, everything changed in seconds. There was no argument, there was no warning, only violence. Blows, kicks, continuous assaults. He tried to defend himself, tried to beg, tried to understand. But there was no room for dialogue in that environment. Michael Bargo's intention was clear from the start. He wanted Seth dead. The attack escalated quickly. Seth was tortured while pleading for help. Gunshots were fired, more than one, more than two, and even wounded, bleeding, terrified, he still found strength to flee the house. He ran, staggered, tried desperately to find a safe place. But he didn't get far. The group ran after him, capturing him again. What happened afterward was even more brutal, especially because Seth, at that moment, no longer had any ability to resist. His fate was sealed. When the violence finally ceased, the group faced the teenager's lifeless body. But instead of stopping, they decided to destroy every trace of the crime. They dragged the body to a fire pit located behind one of the accomplices' homes. There they placed wood, fuel, and lit flames. The objective was clear: make Seth disappear. Reduce a 15-year-old boy, with family, friends, dreams, to ashes. Not satisfied, they collected what remained in buckets. It was dawn when they took it to a nearby quarry, where they discarded everything. Seth's ashes were thrown into the void, as if they had never belonged to a human being. The level of coldness demonstrated in this stage deeply marked investigators. But crimes like this don't stay hidden for long. Stories began to emerge, inconsistencies appeared, and soon authorities received reports. A few days later, the 5 involved were arrested. Michael Bargo, described as the intellectual and emotional leader of the action, carried a posture prosecutors classified as calculated. During interrogations, his behavior did not indicate remorse or surprise. It was as if everything was only a natural consequence of the plan he had created. The interrogation of Michael Shane Bargo, recorded on video and conducted after his arrest, is one of the most revealing moments of the entire case. Not only for the dynamic between him and investigators, but also for the way he shifts between physical pain, emotional confusion, and attempts to maintain some control of the narrative. Right at the start, before any substantive question was asked, Bargo shows his hands and injuries: cuts, broken fingers, dislocated knee. By insisting he is not hurt besides these little things, he tries simultaneously to minimize the wounds and at the same time, justify his condition. It is a common behavior in interrogations involving emotionally disorganized suspects. They try to show strength while implicitly seeking some kind of care or understanding. The scene has a striking contrast. While the investigator maintains a neutral and procedural posture, reading each right in a methodical way, Bargo seems restless, defeated, almost infantilized. He lowers his head, speaks quietly, and at several moments asks for physical help, not emotional help. When the officer asks him to raise his face to hear him better, Bargo shows no resistance. He obeys immediately, almost automatically, signaling a weakened mental state. The crucial point occurs when the investigator needs to clarify whether Bargo does or does not wish to speak without a lawyer. This detail is essential in legal terms, but also psychological. Michael hesitates, wavers, tries to negotiate. He says he wants a lawyer, but at the same time states he wants to talk. It is a typical conflict for someone who fears the consequences of silence while also not wanting to incriminate himself, or who does not know how to manage his own situation. When he finally says, "I'll talk with the lawyer," the investigator ends any possibility of conversation and states that he lost the opportunity to talk. It is a breaking moment. From that point on, Michael realizes he will not have immediate answers about what is happening. The simple question, "What is happening? I have no idea what is happening," reveals more than confusion. It exposes a need for control that he does not have, and a growing fear. The officer responds coldly, "I think you know exactly what is happening." But because he asked for a lawyer, Michael can no longer explain, justify, or manipulate the narrative at that moment. This detail would later be used by the defense to argue that Michael did not have full capacity to understand the situation, suggesting significant cognitive impairments. Another relevant aspect of the interrogation is the body behavior. Bargo is agitated, but not aggressive. He seems exhausted, with compromised coordination, and shows difficulty maintaining continuous attention. His requests to be attended to because of the pain, "I'm bad, I'm hurt," together with his withdrawn posture, suggest not only physical injuries but also a deteriorated mental state. More revealing, however, is what happens outside Bargo's direct statements. The subsequent testimonies, collected right after the interrogation, show that he had spent hours confessing fragments of the crime to people who had no connection to the investigation: his girlfriend's father, the man's partner, friends, acquaintances. It is as if Michael were psychologically unable to hold his own story. When the case reached the jury, the details caused disgust in the community. Witnesses recalled how the house's environment was prepared for the attack. The precision of the actions, the way each participant took on a role, the elaborate attempt to eliminate the body, everything indicated premeditation. There was nothing impulsive or chaotic. It was pure coldness. Therefore, when the final sentence was announced, few people showed surprise. Michael Shane Bargo received the death penalty.
Michael Shane Bargo are sentenced to death.
The jury voted unanimously. For them, the brutality of the crime outweighed any defense argument. The other accomplices were sentenced to life in prison. But while the decision seemed solid, a new chapter was emerging behind the scenes. A chapter that would bring into debate not only the crime itself, but the mind behind it. Bargo's defense argued that he was not just a young man involved in violence, but someone deeply disturbed since his earliest years of life. A young man whose mental disorders were never treated seriously. And that is precisely where the story goes even deeper. When Michael Bargo's defense began reconstructing his personal history, what emerged was a dark portrait of neglect, trauma, and emotional instability. According to his lawyers, Michael did not reach the crime only as a consequence of bad choices. He had arrived there after an entire life marked by flawed diagnoses, untreated crises, and a dangerous family environment. Since childhood, they report, he was considered difficult, restless, aggressive. The first diagnosis was ADHD, but there was never consensus among doctors. Over the years, other labels appeared: bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, severe depression, extreme impulsivity. At 13, he began reporting auditory hallucinations. At 14, he began self-harming behaviors. None of this, according to the defense, was adequately monitored. At home, things were even worse. Bargo grew up in an environment of physical and emotional abuse. His father, court records say, abandoned the family, leaving an overwhelmed mother and a teenager without guidance. Michael began using drugs early as a way to numb the emotional pain. And as the years passed, his instability increased. Teachers and neighbors stated he seemed out of himself in many moments, but no adult truly intervened. When the case reached the courtroom, the prosecution argued that none of this justified the murder of Seth Jackson. Not even explained the coldness shown during each stage of the crime. To them, Bargo was not just a troubled young man. He was someone fully capable of understanding his actions and exercising leadership over others. But the defense insisted, executing a young man with such a severe history of mental disorders would be an ethical and legal mistake. And this argument gained strength years later, when the case was reviewed again. At a new sentencing hearing, prosecutors recalled the brutality of the crime, calling it the coldest, most calculated and premeditated they had ever seen. They stated that Michael was the brains of the operation, someone who planned, motivated, and directed the attack from beginning to end. Meanwhile, the defense presented psychological reports that portrayed another type of young man, someone dominated by episodes, deep emotional instability, hallucinations, and loss of control. Experts claimed that Michael's mental state compromised his judgment and that his already weakened mind could not fully understand the seriousness of his decisions. Despite the intense discussions, the jury again decided on the maximum penalty, death. Michael Bargo remains to this day on death row at Florida State Prison. There is no scheduled date for his execution, but the debate is not over. Behind the scenes, a petition circulates among human rights organizations, lawyers and citizens who believe the case needs to be reconsidered. To them, executing someone with evident mental deficiencies is morally unacceptable and legally questionable. They argue that Michael never received proper treatment during childhood, adolescence, or even after his arrest, and that the death penalty in this context would not bring true closure to Seth's family, only prolong a cycle of suffering. On the other hand, many argue that the crime committed by Bargo is so brutal that no psychological justification would be enough to mitigate his responsibility. For these critics, the execution would be a way to ensure that someone capable of such cruelty never again puts society at risk. The case, therefore, became more than a murder story. It became a debate about justice, moral responsibility, mental disorders, the effectiveness of the death penalty, and how far the line between punishment and compassion goes. And in the end, one question remains that echoes to this day: how to judge a young man whose entire life was marked by violence and mental disorder, but who also carried out one of the coldest crimes of his generation. That is an answer society has not yet been able to find, and may continue trying for many years. If you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thank you and see you next time.